Hi, my name is Elias Mercer. I never liked calling attention to myself, never had the luxury to. My hands have been rough since I was 15, scarred from hammers and wrenches, from lifting, from building. I used to think that if I stayed quiet, if I kept my head down, maybe I could carve out a life without being judged. My family never made me feel like I belonged. Every dinner, every holiday, every casual Sunday felt like a reminder that my existence was optional, like I was a background noise of a home too busy admiring someone else to notice me. The last time I was invited to Thanksgiving, or rather, the last time I thought I might be, I held a small pumpkin pie in my hands, still warm from the oven. I remember standing in the doorway, the aroma curling up from the crust, hoping for a sliver of recognition, a faint thank you, or even a glance. My mother looked at the pie, her eyes fleeting toward me, then away. My father didn't say a word. His silence was always louder than any insult. "You don't need to come this year, Elias." My mother said finally, "David wanted to go smoothly. He's bringing someone special." I nodded, though the weight of the words pressed down on my chest like the very air had turned to stone. I said, "I understand," because I did in some strange, quiet way. Understanding didn't make the pain vanish, but it kept me from screaming, from breaking down in front of them, proving them right. After that Thanksgiving, life didn't pause. I went home, tucked the pie back into the oven for a moment, then set about repairing the leaky faucet in my small apartment. It was a modest place, not much to look at, bare with floors, a sofa worn down by years of use, a kitchen that smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee. But it was mine. Every wrench, every drop of sweat, every spare penny I invested in fixing something or building something tangible was a reminder that at least I had control over some part of my world. I became a plumber out of necessity, but over the years, I made it my craft. I knew that nobody in my family would ever value it, so I valued it for myself. My morning started before sunrise, the city streets empty and silent as I drove to clients' homes, toolbox in the backseat, coffee in hand. Some days it was a leaky faucet, others a burst pipe that flooded the basement with icy water. I worked in the shadows, while my brother David attended networking dinners, and my parents paraded the achievements of someone they thought was worthy of pride. Money was never the point, not at first. Stability, independence, control, that's what I wanted. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began saving. A few dollars here, a few dollars there. I set aside part of every paycheck, watched it grow, and learned how to make it multiply quietly, with patience and careful research. I found online forums and articles about investing, about stocks, ETFs, real estate, anything that promised a way to make hard work compound into freedom. I never told anyone in my family. They had never asked what I did with my time or money. They assumed it didn't matter. That was my advantage. I quietly built a financial safety net so strong that when the time came, I could move without permission, without validation. I could finally exist in a space where my worth wasn't being measured against someone else's image of perfection. One morning, a year after that Thanksgiving, I checked my email and noticed something that made me stop cold. My sister had tagged David and his girlfriend in a photo taken at a high-end restaurant downtown. They were smiling, dressed impeccably, David's hand resting possessively on her back. The kind of photograph that told the world, this is who belongs. I looked at it for a long moment, feeling the sting of exclusion all over again. It wasn't jealousy, it was recognition of a pattern. They had always chosen appearances over truth, image over substance. And now, in their orchestrated little universe, they assumed I would remain invisible forever. I sipped my coffee, bitter and black, thinking about all the evenings I had spent poring over spreadsheets, reading financial reports, watching my investments grow, learning the language of wealth in secret. If they had known, they would have dismissed it. A plumber? Investing? That's laughable, they would have said, perhaps smirking over a glass of Chardonnay. And yet, all those years of quiet diligence had built something they couldn't touch or belittle. I realized then that invisibility had been my superpower. For months, I kept my routine, fixing leaks, tightening valves, analyzing returns on the quiet. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real, and it was mine. Then came a knock at my door 5 days after Thanksgiving. Not a casual knock, but one that carried the rehearsed arrogance of people accustomed to commanding attention rather than earning it. I wiped my hands on my rag, set my wrench down, and opened the door. There they were, David, looking every bit the entitled sibling, his girlfriend smiling as though the world revolved around them, my mother, perfectly coiffed, eyes sharp and calculating, and my sister, performing the part of familial concern. The air between us was electric, thick with tension and the weight of years spent being unseen. They had come to confront, to negotiate, to assess. What they didn't know was that their assumptions had already been dismantled silently, methodically, piece by piece. The Elias Mercer they thought they controlled no longer existed for them to control. I stepped aside, letting them enter, though the gesture was more habit than courtesy. They expected me to be small, apologetic, malleable. But I wasn't. I was standing in a life I had built for myself, one that required no validation from their selective affection. And for the first time, I realized just how far that quiet perseverance had brought me. The night settled over the valley like a heavy curtain, blotting out what little warmth the sun had left. Shadows stretched across the worn wooden floorboards of the cabin, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Inside, the air grew stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and smoke that never seemed to leave the chimney properly. He sat at the small wooden table, the same table where countless silent meals had passed, and stared at the single candle flickering in front of him. The wax dripped slowly, steady as a heartbeat. Each drop echoed against the tin plate beneath it, a metronome for thoughts he could not silence. The room felt smaller tonight, tighter somehow, as if the walls were inching closer. He rubbed at his temples, trying to quiet the restless buzzing inside his head, but it only grew louder. Outside, the wind clawed at the shutters with sharp fingers, howling in short, broken bursts. He told himself it was just the storm approaching. That was all, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. The storm was not what unsettled him. It was the silence between the gusts. Silence that seemed to lean in listening. For months, he had ignored the unease crawling beneath the skin. At first, it was only whispers in the dark, sounds he could dismiss as imagination, a creak on the porch, a shift in the rafters, footsteps that vanished when he opened the door. Yet tonight, everything pressed heavier. The air felt charged, like the sky just before lightning cracked it open. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor with a scream that startled even him. His hand instinctively reached for the old rifle leaning in the corner. The barrel was cold, the metal biting into his palm as if reminding him of all the nights before, of all the fears he had tried to bury under routine. He moved toward the window and parted the curtain. The valley below stretched into darkness, a vast ocean of shadow broken only by the pale outline of Widow's Ridge. Even in the dark, he could see the skeletal trees swaying against the wind. Beyond them, faint dots of light flickered. Too far, too strange to be lanterns. They blinked in and out like signals in some forgotten code. He froze. There was again the faintest outline of movement near the ridge. Too deliberate to be branches swaying. Too steady to be shadows. A figure, maybe two, slipping between the trees. Watching. His chest tightened, each breath shallow and sharp. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the storm, the way lightning played with the eyes. Yet the storm had not broken. No lightning had come. The night was solid, heavy and unbroken. The candle sputtered behind him, sending long fingers of shadow crawling up the wall. He turned quickly, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Only the table, the candle, the chair tipped awkwardly on its side. He was not alone. He knew it now. The air shifted, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. Blood. Old, faint, but unmistakable. His pulse thundered. His mind screamed to run, to leave the cabin behind and flee into night, storm or no storm. But his feet, rooted to the floor, bound by something heavier than fear, curiosity. He wanted to know, needed to know. Why here? Why now? He set the rifle on the table, careful not to make a sound, and reached for the small wooden box tucked beneath the floorboards. His fingers trembled as he lifted it free. The box was older than the cabin itself, its edges worn smooth, its lock long since broken. Inside were the letters, dozens of them, each one yellowed, the ink fading. Letters he had sworn never to read again. But something in the valley was calling them back to life. He opened the first one with shaking hands. The words blurred for a moment, his eyes refusing to focus. When they finally did, the chill deepened. If the ridge lights again, it means the debt is not paid. His stomach dropped. The handwriting was his father's. He shoved the letter back into the box, heart racing. He had been just a boy when his father wrote those words, too young to understand what kind of debt could make a man write something so final. His father had never spoken of it, and then one winter, he was simply gone, swallowed by the same ridge now glowing in the distance. A sound snapped through cabin. 3 deliberate knocks on the door. Not thunder, not wind, knocks. He froze. His breath caught in his throat. Whoever, whatever, stood outside had been waiting, listening, and now it wanted in. The candle flickered once, then died, plunging the room into darkness. And in that darkness, he heard it, a voice, low, familiar, whispering his name. The knocks continued, deliberate, measured, each one echoing to the cabin as if the walls themselves were alive. He held his breath, the rifle heavy in his hands, his knuckles white against the stock. He had learned long ago that hesitation could be deadly, yet some part of him refused to act, not out of fear, but recognition. The voice came again, closer this time, whispered yet distinct. "It's time, Ezra." His blood froze. Ezra. That wasn't his name, not anymore, not for the outside world. But in the valleys and ridges of this place, the old name clung to him like a shadow, a memory he couldn't erase. He crouched behind the table, the wooden box still clutched tightly as the wind rattled the windows. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the force pressing on the cabin, on the ridge, demanded attention. It was not random. It never had been. Years ago, his father had spoken in hushed tones about the ridge and the light that danced there at night. "Never go looking," he'd said. "It waits for debts unpaid." Back then, as a boy, he had imagined spirits, shadows, something from the old stories. But now he knew better. The debts were real, and the ridge was a reckoning. The cabin door creaked, not violently, but subtly like a whisper of motion. He knew the door was locked, bolted from the inside, and yet the air felt as if it had shifted. Someone or something was testing him, pressing, probing, waiting. He opened the box again, shoving the letters aside with trembling hands. Beneath them lay the small, worn ledger his father had kept, a record of debts owed, favors collected, promises made. Some written in neat, careful script, some scrawled in ink that had run into a blurred stain over time. His father's voice seemed to echo from the pages, a warning he had ignored for too long. The ledger revealed the first names, the exact amounts, and in some cases, the threats. But one entry made him freeze, staring at the faded ink like it had grown sharper overnight. Ezra Kane, balance unsettled. Ridge will claim what is owed. A chill ran down his spine. Ridge, the very place he had avoided. The hill behind the old barn where the apple tree grew crooked and gnarled. The hill that had always seemed like a boundary between the familiar and the unknown. The candle flickered back to life, inexplicably, as if the wind itself had conspired to return it. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into shapes he didn't recognize, yet felt intimately connected to. He felt their weight, a history pressing against his chest. And then he saw it. Through the window, a faint glow emanating from a ridge. The same light his father had warned about, flickering like a heartbeat in the night. It wasn't just light. It was awareness, intent, a presence that waited for him to step beyond the safety of his cabin. Memories surfaced, unbidden, like fragments of a life half-lived. Nights spent under the apple tree, watching his brother claim every advantage, every reward. The feeling of being overlooked, underestimated, ignored. And yet, beneath it all, a thread of survival had grown. Silent, stubborn, unyielding. That thread was all he had now. He moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. The glow pulsed again, brighter this time, almost as if beckoning him. He could feel it in his bones. The ridge demanded attention, demanded resolution. Every fiber was being told him to flee. Yet another, older voice whispered, "Face it." He grabbed his coat, the rifle slung across his back, and stepped into the cold night. Gravel crunched beneath his boots, half frozen, sharp against quiet. The wind cut through him, carried with it the scent of wet earth, cedar, and smoke. He kept his eyes fixed on the ridge, the glow pulling him forward like a tide. As he approached, the familiar contours of the apple tree came into view, twisted and skeletal against the darkened sky. But the ridge itself seemed transformed, alive with a soft, undulating light. He knew it was not fire, not lanterns. Something else, something old, something patient, was waiting. The wind carried voices, distant, murmuring, almost lost in its howl. He strained to listen. They weren't human, not exactly. Yet there was familiarity in the cadence, a rhythm he recognized from childhood. The same rhythm that had governed the house, the family, the hidden ledger of debts and favors. And then he saw the first figure. At the crest of the ridge, a shadowy form stepped into the light. Not threatening, not yet, but present, observing. A presence as deliberate as the knocks on the cabin door, as deliberate as the whispers that called his old name into the night. His heart pounded. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted him. He felt the weight of years pressing down, the years he had spent building, saving, hiding, all the silent victories, all the quiet perseverance, now intersecting with something far larger than he had ever imagined. The figure remained still, and then another appeared, smaller, as if it had emerged from the shadows themselves. The ridge was no longer just a hill. It was a ledger made flesh, a reckoning, and it arrived at the precise moment he had always tried to avoid. For the first time in years, Ezra Kane, or the man they had always known only by his work, felt the full weight of what his father's warnings had truly meant. The debts, the legacy, the ridge itself, they demanded something from him. And he realized with a clarity that made the cold bite sharper that nothing he had built in silence would shield him from this reckoning. Yet, as he drew nearer, he felt something unexpected, a measure of resolve. Years of being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated. It had forged something in him, something quiet, unshakable, and entirely his own. The glow pulsed again, and he took a step forward. The ridge stretched before him like a living thing, breathing softly under the pale wash of the moonlight. Ezra felt every pulse of wind like a warning, like the ridge itself knew every misstep he had ever made, every silence he had ever kept. He paused for a moment, gripping the rifle tighter, not to use it, but to steady himself, to feel the weight of reality pressing into his chest. He had thought he understood the world, that his quiet diligence, his steady hands, his small victories in the trades and in secret investments had built some kind of immunity. But here on this ridge, immunity meant nothing. Every step he took crunched against the frostbitten earth, and he could hear it echo across the incline. The shadows and the moonlight stretched unnaturally, reaching for him as if curious, as if they knew him already. He remembered the ledger, the father's warnings, and the soft insistence in his own memory. Face it! He wondered if this was what his father had feared, or if he had somehow understood it too late. The first figure, tall and shadowed, stepped forward. Not a man, not entirely, but a presence that filled the air with quiet authority. Ezra froze for a heartbeat, then another. He had faced angry clients, dismissive family members, even the occasional robber, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. There was a weight here, an understanding of debts that were not counted in dollars, a ledger that was written in the lives and choices of men. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, keeping his eyes on the figure. His heart thrummed like a warning drum in his ears. He had lived a life built on patience, on quiet accumulation of both skill and wealth. He had invested in futures, both in money and in himself. He had avoided confrontation, allowed the world to ignore him. And yet here he was, confronted by something older, something that recognized every unspoken bargain he had ever made. A smaller figure emerged behind the first, almost imperceptible until it stepped into moonlight. A child's height, but not a child, or at least not entirely. The smaller presence moved with the same certainty as the larger one, shadows stretching from it like fingers, delicate yet unwavering. Ezra's mind raced. Was this some kind of test? Some reflection of his own guilt, of the years he had spent outside the family's favor, building quietly while others praised themselves loudly? He reached the base of the ridge, stopping under the apple tree, twisted and gnarled, the one he had known as a boy. Its branches clawed at the sky, silhouetted against the moonlight like the fingers of someone long gone. He felt the weight of the ledger in his mind, the words etched into the margins. Balance unsettled. The debts were not just numbers. They were expectations, promises, mistakes, sins, and omissions. Ezra had thought he could outrun them with diligence, with patience, with hidden successes. He had believed that his careful silence would shelter him. But the ridge demanded more. It demanded acknowledgement, confrontation, and reckoning. Every achievement he had hoarded in solitude suddenly seemed fragile, like paper in a storm. The tall figure moved again closer, but still distant enough to command attention rather than fear. Ezra noticed something in its posture, not hostility, but observation. Every line of his body, every decision he had made, every sacrifice he had kept secret. The ridge saw it all. He remembered the quiet nights spent counting coins, the missed opportunities, the small steps of calculated patience. And he realized with an unsettling clarity that the ridge did not care about his finances, his trade skills, or his clever investments. It cared about the balance. The air thickened around him, like walking into syrup. He could see the faint shimmer of frost on the branches and the faint glow that seemed to emanate from the very ground, pulsing gently in time with a heartbeat. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. And then a sound, soft and distinct, whispered across the ridge, a voice almost lost in the wind, saying it's time to settle. Ezra's breath caught. He had spent decades building a life of quiet triumph, and yet here was a reckoning that transcended wealth or skill. It was personal, elemental, and unforgiving. He realized that the ledger his father had kept, the stories he'd been told, were not just warnings. They were maps, guides to survival. And now, every choice, every moment of silence, every path he had taken in isolation had led him here. The smaller figure stepped closer, revealing a familiarity he could not name, yet recognized. Shadows fell across its face, half hidden, half revealed. Ezra felt an old ache in his chest, a memory of days when his presence had gone unnoticed, when his efforts had been minimized, and yet, even in that oversight, there had been a power he did not yet fully understand. He clenched his fists, feeling the blood rush through his veins. He had built a life from nothing, silently, with patience and resolve. And though the ridge demanded he confront the debts of the past, he also understood that this confrontation would not define him. He would define it. The ledger of his life, long kept hidden, would finally speak. The tall figure's shadow shifted. The glow of the ridge brightened, illuminating the frost-crusted earth and the twisted limbs of the apple tree. Ezra felt a pulse in the ground, a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat, slow, deliberate, insistent. The ridge had called him, and he had come. Now it was time to listen, to understand, and perhaps to finally step beyond the silence that had once been his shield. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air slice through his lungs, and moved forward. The figures on the ridge waited, unyielding, patient, knowing that this was more than a meeting. It was a reckoning. And for the first time in decades, Ezra Kane felt that the life he had built in quiet solitude might finally confront the truths he had long ignored. The frost on the ridge glimmered under the dim moonlight as Ezra moved closer to figures, every step deliberate, every heartbeat echoing in the quiet night. The taller figure didn't speak, but Ezra felt its presence like a living weight, a shadow that followed him through every unnoticed accomplishment, every quiet triumph, every denied acknowledgement. He had always believed success could be hidden, quietly accumulated, but here, nothing was invisible. The smaller figure stepped forward, revealing a face both familiar and strange. It was not someone he had met before, yet something in the eyes, sharp and knowing, pierced straight into years of suppressed frustration, the decades of patient calculation. Ezra realized almost reluctantly that these figures were not just guardians of the ridge. They were mirrors, reflections of what had been denied, ignored, and dismissed. They held up to him the ledger of his life, the debts unpaid, the truths ignored. He remembered his family's faces, their dismissive glances, the condescending tones that accompanied every effort he had made. His father, cloaked in quiet disapproval. His mother, offering approval only when it suited her image. His brother, proud and loud, claiming victories that were not entirely his. And himself, Ezra Kane, working silently, building a life not for validation, but because the act of creating had been necessary, a lifeline. The taller figure shifted slightly, and Ezra felt the weight of unspoken expectation pressing against him. This was not a threat. It was a challenge, a reckoning not of money, not of fame, not of skill, but of essence. For decades, he had hidden his value, believing that the quiet accumulation of wealth and stability could somehow fill the void left by his family's indifference. Yet here, the ridge demanded a confrontation far deeper. Ezra's mind wandered back to the winter evenings spent in his small workshop, hands black with grease, eyes tired but steady, counting coins and calculating every small investment. He remembered the whispered encouragement of Sage, the careful guidance that had allowed him to grow quietly, unseen. He had learned to value himself not through the eyes of those who ignored him, but through the meticulous care with which he nurtured his own life. Yet, the ridge reminded him, acknowledgement matters, not for ego, but for survival. The smaller figure tilted its head, and suddenly, Ezra felt an undeniable pull, a memory surfacing from deep within. It was a day he had tried to explain to his father the plan for the small workshop, the expansion, the apprentices he hoped to train. His father's polite dismissal, the folded paper, the brief look of doubt. It had haunted him longer than any insult or slight. Every success he had quietly achieved felt overshadowed by that early, formative dismissal. Now, here, under the twisted apple tree, he could feel it all converging. The ridge was not merely land. It was a repository of human oversight. Every slight, every injustice, every unnoticed act of effort, accumulating like frost over decades. Ezra's patience, his careful life, had not gone unnoticed. It had been recorded, measured, and now it was time for reckoning. He took a deliberate breath, feeling the cold slice through his lungs, and stepped closer. The larger figure leaned slightly forward, and Ezra could see the faint outlines of symbols etched into its cloak, unfamiliar yet oddly recognizable, like something the subconscious had always known. The smaller figure moved aside, revealing a map carved into the ridge itself, lines and markings that mirrored the choices, paths, and detours of his life. It was then that he understood. The ridge was more than just a place. It was a reflection of his existence. Every misstep, every ignored opportunity, every silent victory had shaped the contours of this land. The figures were not enemies. They were arbiters, measuring the worth of a life lived in quiet resilience, a life built without applause, without recognition. Ezra knelt briefly at the base of the apple tree, feeling the rough bark against his palms. He thought of the Christmases he had spent alone, the quiet birthdays, the unnoticed triumphs in trade competitions, the financial accounts grown through patient diligence, hidden from a family who never asked. He thought of the nights spent planning, calculating, and surviving, and he realized something fundamental. Their indifference had not diminished him. It had refined him. The taller figure stepped aside, and for the first time, Ezra could see the moonlight illuminate the small figure fully. The face was etched with a quiet wisdom, the kind that comes from understanding both injustice and perseverance. He felt a sudden warmth, not of comfort, but of acknowledgement. The ridge had spoken. The ledger of his life, long overlooked, had been measured and recorded. And now, Ezra Kane understood the truth. He had not merely survived. He had been tempered into someone unbreakable. He rose slowly, brushing frost from his jacket. The figures remained still, patient, but no longer ominous. Ezra felt the weight of years lift slightly, replaced by a clarity he had never experienced. He had built something impervious, not through recognition, not through validation, but through the steady accumulation of effort, resilience, and intelligence. The ridge exhaled softly, the wind carrying the subtle acknowledgement through the trees. Ezra Kane knew, in that moment, that the confrontation with his family, the slights, the dismissals, the invisibility, they had all been lessons in preparation. For what lay ahead was no longer about earning acknowledgement or fighting for respect. It was about living unshakably independently, and in full ownership of the life he had silently, patiently built. He turned back toward the path leading home, the ridge receding behind him like a sentinel, a reminder that the weight of the past could always teach, but never bind him again. Ezra walked down carefully, each step firm, measured, carrying with him not just the tools of his trade or the ledger of his investments, but the undeniable truth. He was enough, in every quiet way, in every hidden triumph. And as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, illuminating the frost with a soft golden light, Ezra felt something he hadn't felt in decades: freedom. Not the hollow freedom of outward approval, but the profound freedom of self-knowledge, self-reliance, and finally, self-respect. The ridge had given its judgment, and for the first time in his life, he realized it was one he could accept and carry forward unafraid. Ezra returned from the ridge as the first slivers of morning light filtered through the blinds of his modest apartment. He had spent hours walking among shadows and frost, reflecting on every slight, every dismissal, every overlooked moment that had shaped the man he had quietly become. For years, he had believed that silence and hard work alone would shield him from the judgment of others. Now, he realized silence had been a sword, sharp but hidden, and he was ready to wield it with precision. The phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he hadn't wanted to confront yet. His mother. For years, her calls had been sparse, usually laced with subtle criticism disguised as concern. But today, there was urgency in her text. "We need to talk. Please come by." Ezra didn't hesitate. He had spent long enough letting others define his worth. If they wanted answers, they would get them. Driving through familiar streets of his hometown, Ezra felt the weight of memory pressing against the edges of his consciousness. Every corner of the city whispered stories of youth, frustration, and small victories overlooked. The streetlights flickered as he passed the house where he had grown up, the house that had never quite felt like home. He parked across the street and stepped out, letting the cold air bite through his jacket, bracing himself for the confrontation ahead. Inside, the house smelled the same: cedar and old varnish, a faint trace of incense his mother liked to burn when she wanted to mask tension. His father sat in his usual armchair, reading the morning paper, eyes briefly flicking up but not registering his presence. Gideon, his brother, lounged on the sofa, exuding effortless confidence, the kind of confidence that had always annoyed him to no end. And then there was Clara, his sister, perched near the window with her phone in hand, her expression neutral but expectant. Ezra's footsteps were deliberate as he crossed the threshold. He didn't greet anyone. Silence, he realized, had become his voice. He placed a small leather-bound folder on the table in front of his mother. The subtle weight of it spoke volumes, a quiet announcement that had arrived not just physically, but with intent. For a moment, no one moved. Ezra felt the years of indifference and hidden efforts stacking the air between them. Then he spoke, his voice calm, measured, but carrying the undeniable authority of someone who had built everything without permission, without applause. "I know why I wasn't invited last Thanksgiving," he said. The words were simple, but they carried decades of restrained frustration. "And I understand why. You've always preferred image over substance, appearances over the person standing in front of you." His mother's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her composed mask. His father didn't look up. Gideon leaned back, smirking as if preparing for a laugh. Clara's lips pressed together, sensing the storm in the calm delivery. "I've spent the past 10 years building a life quietly," Ezra continued. "Every investment, every calculated risk, every long night spent studying the markets of my craft was done without asking for your approval or recognition. And yet, here I am, not because you believed in me, not because you nurtured me, but because I chose to value myself when no one else did." He opened the folder, sliding out spreadsheets, bank statements, and investment summaries, each one carefully annotated and time-stamped. "I've grown a portfolio that would surprise you," he said. "Every penny accounted for, every transaction legitimate. I did this not to prove a point, but because I finally realized that my worth isn't defined by your perception." Gideon's smirk faltered. The first murmur of tension filled the room. Clara put down her phone, leaning in slightly, intrigued despite herself. His father's eyes finally lifted, scanning the documents, lingering over the numbers. The room had shifted. For the first time, Ezra was not invisible. "I'm not here to ask for approval," Ezra said, standing taller, the folder in his hand now a symbol of silent power. "I'm here to remind you that neglect, disdain, and dismissal cannot erase what's built in quiet resilience. I am not the son you overlooked. I am the man you underestimated." The room was silent. His mother's lips trembled, unsure if tears or words should come first. Gideon's jaw tightened, his pride struggling to mask surprise. His father, silent but calculating, finally muttered something under his breath, though the words were lost in the weight of the unspoken acknowledgement. Ezra closed the folder with deliberate calm. "I've shared this with you so that there's no longer any illusion. No more half-truths, no more invisible effort. You can either recognize what I've achieved or continue as if nothing exists beyond your selective perception. But know this, my life, my success, my value, none of it relies on your approval anymore." He turned, stepping toward the door, leaving the room in a stunned silence. Behind him, he could feel their eyes tracking his every movement. The first true recognition in years, though not yet accompanied by acceptance or understanding. Ezra knew it didn't matter. Recognition from them was not the currency of his worth. Walking back to his car, folder safely tucked under his arm, he felt a subtle shift within himself. Years of quiet labor, years of patience, and years of enduring subtle dismissal had culminated in this moment. A confrontation not of anger, but of undeniable truth. The frost-covered streets reflected the rising sun as Ezra slid behind the wheel. His reflection in the rear-view mirror showed a man who had survived, thrived, and declared his independence without violence or shouting. For the first time, he understood fully that freedom came not from being accepted, but from being unshakably sure of one's own worth. As he drove away from the house, a sense of clarity settled over him. He would continue building, continuing investing, and continuing to thrive. And when the day came that his family sought to participate in his life, not as a matter of choice, but because they had no other option, they would find him unchanged, unwavering, and fully, unapologetically himself. For Ezra Kane, this was only the beginning. The days following that confrontation were a strange mix of silence and tension. Ezra returned to his apartment, the same modest space that had borne witness to years of silent labor and meticulous planning. Yet now, every corner seemed to hum with a new energy, a subtle reminder that what he had achieved quietly could no longer remain unseen. He could feel their curiosity lingering, like a shadow stretching across the streets of his neighborhood, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they tried to interfere, to manipulate, or to reclaim a stake in what he had painstakingly built. He sat at his kitchen table, the folder still open before him. Each document, each annotation, was not just numbers on a page. They were years of sacrifice, of patience, of resilience. Ezra had kept meticulous records of his investments, tracking every dividend, every growth, every reinvestment. He had quietly amassed a portfolio that would put many seasoned investors to shame. And yet, the greatest satisfaction wasn't the figures themselves. It was the knowledge that all of this existed independently of anyone's approval or validation. He had grown, thrived, and prospered in silence, and now that silence had become his shield. But the peace he felt was fragile. Almost immediately, subtle signs of intrusion began to appear. One morning, he found a brochure slipped under his door, glossy and expensive, promoting a high-end networking event. On the cover was Gideon's familiar smug smile, alongside Clara and their closest social connections. The message was clear. They had not forgotten him. They were inviting him, or rather, testing him, tempting him to re-enter a world he had chosen to observe from the sidelines. Ezra's reaction was deliberate. He didn't respond. He didn't call, didn't write. He sat, observing the material, noting the curated smiles, the careful placement of influence and power. This was an invitation. It was a subtle assertion of control, a reminder that they believed they still had leverage over him. But Ezra no longer believed in their leverage. His strategy had changed. He wouldn't play by their rules. He would let them act first, and he would act last. By midweek, the pressure intensified. A private investigator, one Ezra recognized from past encounters with corporate clients, had apparently been hired by his family. Reports of Ezra's spending, his movements, even the addresses of his properties, were quietly being compiled. When he saw the first report, a thin stack of papers with meticulously documented activities, he smiled faintly. They thought they could intimidate him, but in reality, they had just handed him the ultimate tool, proof of their own obsession with his life. Ezra responded the only way he knew how. He reviewed every line of the report, comparing it against his own records. Every transaction, every movement, every investment, clean, transparent, legitimate. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. They had nothing. No dirt, no scandal, no leverage. Just their frustration and disbelief at a life they had ignored until it became inconveniently visible. Then came the subtle psychological maneuvers. His mother called sporadically, each conversation an attempt to elicit guilt, to paint concern as care. Gideon reached out indirectly through mutual acquaintances, offering friendly advice on investment strategy and business expansion. Clara posted vague social media updates hinting at family unity, celebrating togetherness in ways that clearly excluded him. Each act was designed to draw him in, to provoke a reaction. Ezra, however, remained unmoved. He watched the patterns unfold like pieces on a chessboard. Every message, every call, every post was met with calm observation. He made a deliberate choice to maintain distance, to let them act, and to prepare his response not out of anger, but out of strategy. His investments, his work, his carefully constructed life, these were untouchable. Their attempts to manipulate could only reach him if he allowed it. One evening, as twilight descended over the city, Ezra sat in his apartment overlooking the river. The light glinted off the water, fragmented like the reflections of the past years of neglect and quiet struggle. He opened his laptop, reviewing performance charts, checking market trends, and noting opportunities that even Gideon could not foresee. With every click, every note, every calculation, Ezra felt a quiet satisfaction. They could never touch this. Their influence ended at the door of his apartment, at the boundary of his effort and his perseverance. Yet the most important moment was still to come. Ezra knew that a family unaccustomed to rejection would escalate, would attempt a grand gesture, a spectacle to remind him of their supposed power. And when that moment arrived, he would be ready, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who had endured years of dismissal, yet emerged unbroken, deliberate, and unstoppable. He would not just respond. He would define the terms. The test arrived sooner than he anticipated. It was a Friday morning when a familiar hum of luxury cars rolled into the small parking lot outside his apartment. Ezra watched from the window as Gideon's black BMW glinted under the sun, Clara in the passenger seat, and their attorney, an intimidating figure, exiting with files in hand. They had come not as family, not as relatives, but as negotiators, attempting to seize what they believed was theirs. Ezra didn't panic. He made himself a coffee, black, bitter as always. He prepared himself mentally for the confrontation, reminding himself of a simple truth. Every move he had made, every sacrifice, every night spent building quietly, had led to this point. They had walked into the arena he had prepared for years, and now he would decide the terms of engagement. By the time they knocked, Ezra was calm, poised, and entirely unafraid. This wasn't about proving his worth anymore. It was about asserting it in a world that had spent far too long underestimating him. He opened the door, his presence filling the threshold, and in that instant, the power balance had shifted. He had won, not through loud declarations, not through drama, but through relentless persistence, quiet intelligence, and unwavering patience. The knock was deliberate, calculated, the kind that carried expectation, anticipation, and a subtle threat all in one. Ezra had been expecting this moment, yet it felt surreal when it finally arrived. He stood in the doorway of his modest apartment, the morning light slicing through the blinds and landing across his calm expression. Outside, Gideon's black BMW gleamed arrogantly, a silent proclamation of status and entitlement. Claire's designer coat was immaculately arranged, and their attorney's sharp posture suggested business, not family. They had come to negotiate, to influence, to remind him that in their eyes, he still belonged to a world he had long abandoned. Ezra's heart was steady. There was no tremor in his hands, no doubt in his stance. Years of silent toil, years of quiet accumulation, had taught him patience, strategy, and the strength of detachment. He could see every intention behind their carefully curated expressions. They expected to intimidate, to provoke a reaction, to unsettle him with presence alone. But Ezra had spent years building resilience against exactly this kind of intrusion. As he opened the door, the sunlight caught the sharp edges of the attorney's briefcase, the sheen of Clara's jewelry, and the subtle tension in Gideon's posture. The atmosphere was thick, like the calm before a storm, but Ezra didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped aside, letting them enter without invitation, but on his terms. He could feel the shift immediately. Their surprise was tangible. They hadn't expected him to meet their arrival with neutrality, with composed observation rather than the flinch or anger they might have provoked in the past. Inside, the apartment was modest but organized, every item purposeful, every surface reflecting the quiet diligence of someone who built their life from the ground up. Gideon's eyes flicked over space, perhaps searching for flaws, perhaps for signs of inadequacy. Clara's gaze lingered on the stacks of documents on the table, neatly arranged folders that suggested precision, foresight, and accomplishment. The attorney's hand rested on his briefcase, a silent thread of legal maneuvering. But Ezra's calm didn't waver. They started immediately, Gideon speaking first, attempting charm, authority, and the faintest trace of condescension. His words were carefully selected, designed to probe, to unsettle, to lure Ezra into some emotional trap. "We've seen your portfolio," Gideon began, "and we have to say it's impressive. But we need to talk about your future, opportunities that could align with the family." Ezra listened silently, his posture unmoved, his mind noting every nuance, every hidden intent. This wasn't about opportunity. They had no interest in collaboration unless it benefited their image. Clara followed, speaking of unity, support, and family values, her tone sweet practiced, almost rehearsed. She moved as if performing for an audience only she could see. Ezra noticed the subtle gestures, the faint glances exchanged between her, Gideon, and the attorney. This was a coordinated effort, a carefully scripted attempt to reclaim influence, to assert dominance over a life they had ignored for decades. Ezra responded only once, his voice measured, calm, deliberate. "I appreciate your concern," he said, "but my life has been built independently. I am not here to negotiate approval or validation. My work, my investments, my choices, they exist outside of the expectations you've tried to impose on me my entire life." The room shifted. Gideon's composure faltered, just slightly, a micro-expression of frustration flashing across his face before it was masked. Clara's eyes widened ever so subtly, the rehearsed charm faltering under the weight of his words. The attorney leaned in, expecting some legal concession, some wavering, but found only a quiet, unwavering resolve. Minutes stretched into hours, though time moved differently under the tension of old family wounds and long-held resentments. Ezra spoke rarely, letting their words unravel, exposing the weakness in their arguments, the self-interest hidden beneath the facade of concern. They tried subtle persuasion, emotional appeals, even thinly veiled threats of exclusion or inheritance manipulation. But Ezra met every attempt with equanimity. He didn't need to convince them of his worth. They had already demonstrated they never would. He only needed to stand firm in his own. At one point, Gideon leaned closer, a dangerous edge to his tone, hinting at consequences that were supposed to provoke fear or submission. Ezra looked him squarely in the eye and said, "I am accountable only to my actions and my ethics. I've spent years building a life of integrity, and no speculation or intimidation can change that." Clara's lips parted, perhaps to argue, perhaps to beg, but Ezra held their gaze with quiet authority. The subtle power shift was complete. They were no longer in a position to command, to judge, or to intimidate. They had walked into his domain, and in doing so, had placed themselves on his terms. By the end of the encounter, the truth was undeniable. Ezra's silence, patience, and persistence had transformed what had once been perceived as weakness into undeniable strength. The documents, the meticulous records, the proof of legitimate success, they could not argue against it. All they could do was retreat frustrated, humiliated by their own misjudgment. As they departed, Ezra didn't follow. He stood in the doorway, watching them drive away, the sun catching the glossy black of the BMW one last time before it disappeared down the street. The apartment was quiet again, the silence heavy with the realization that he was finally free, not just from their judgment, but from emotional chains that had constrained him for so long. He returned to his table, to the folders, to the life he had built with his own hands. No one had forced him to grow. No one had demanded his success. It had been his choice, his diligence, and his patience that brought him here. And for the first time in decades, Ezra allowed himself a small smile. Not victory over them, but a liberation of self-recognition and the quiet, unshakable certainty that his life was, finally, entirely his own. By the next morning, Ezra could already feel the ripples of their visit spreading outward. The neighborhood that had once been merely background now felt like a stage, each passerby a spectator in a play they had no desire to attend. Whispers traveled fast in the cars on the street. Quiet assumptions and questions about his success buzzed behind polite nods. Ezra walked to the corner cafe, the place where he had quietly celebrated minor victories over the years, only to find the usual barista casting glances over the counter, hesitating, and finally mumbling, "Heard about your, portfolio." Ezra ignored it, ordered his black coffee, and sat in the same corner booth where he had learned patience, diligence, and discretion. The phone call started not long after. Former clients, contractors, even acquaintances who had known him for years, now asked questions with thinly veiled suspicion. The truth had never been a problem until his family decided to weaponize perception. Gideon had spun his absence at Thanksgiving into an elaborate narrative, painting Ezra's quiet success as some form of dishonesty, even hinting at financial misconduct. The irony was brutal. The years of meticulous accounting, the legal confirmations, the investments built on careful, legitimate research, none of it mattered when faced with a manufactured story. Ezra did not panic. He had anticipated this, built contingencies, and documented every step of his financial life. Still, watching people question his integrity stung, a reminder that validation from the world outside could never replace self-respect. He spent the day meticulously reviewing every transaction, every record, every note he had kept over the past decade. Receipts, notarized statements, investment confirmations, bank statements, all lined neatly across his dining table. The apartment smelled faintly of cedar from the small incense burner he kept, a comforting constant amidst the chaos outside. News articles began to appear online within hours. Local entrepreneur under scrutiny. Kane family secrets revealed was a headline of one, accompanied by a grainy photograph taken without his consent. Another claimed, financial success or financial foul play. Asheville's quiet prodigy raises eyebrows. Ezra read each piece, his expression calm but his mind sharply aware. The media had no allegiance to truth, only to drama, and Gideon had learned precisely how to feed it. Yet amid the rising storm, Ezra found clarity. The situation, though chaotic, served as proof of a hard-earned principle. No one's perception could define his reality. He was not just surviving, he was thriving, independent of familial approval, public validation, or societal expectation. The calm he had cultivated over the years became a shield, allowing him to process each accusation, each rumor, and each probing question without losing control. Sage's texts were steady, unwavering. She reminded him to document everything, to remain calm, and, above all, to trust in the foundation he had painstakingly built. She refused to intervene publicly, insisting that his victory would be sweeter if it was earned entirely by his diligence and patience. Her confidence in him, unshaken, became a lifeline. She believed in the value of silent consistency, of accumulating quiet victories until the world could no longer ignore them. Days blurred into weeks. Ezra kept his routine, meeting clients, inspecting projects, and maintaining the quiet life that had allowed him to grow unobserved for so long. Occasionally, he would glance at the headlines, noting the absence of correction, the persistence of rumors. Each mention, each casual implication that he had somehow cheated or manipulated the system was met with the same response: verification, evidence, clarity. Every record, every legitimate transaction, every proof of compliance was meticulously organized, ready to counter any false claim. Then one morning, a familiar email arrived from a trusted long-term client. Subject line, urgent media inquiry. They had been contacted by a reporter with vague accusations of financial impropriety, and they wanted reassurance. Ezra calmly drafted a response, attaching a series of notarized statements, financial logs, and investment confirmations. The email went out precise and factual. Within hours, the client replied with relief, gratitude, and renewed trust. One by one, the network of doubt Gideon had tried to cast began to crumble, not through confrontation, but through meticulous documentation, clarity, and the silent strength Ezra had always relied upon. By the end of the month, the public narrative began to shift subtly. Articles retracted speculative language. Interviews with neutral observers highlighted Ezra's legitimacy, and the whispers around town transformed into cautious acknowledgement. People who had doubted now began to understand that his success was neither borrowed nor manufactured. It was earned. And while some still clung to the sensationalist version of the story, the foundation of truth remained unshakable. Ezra often walked along the French Broad River in the evenings, a ritual of reflection and release. The water churned and sparkled beneath the fading light, indifferent to the chaos humans created around it. Standing on the bank, he considered the contrast between the fleeting opinions of others and the enduring reality of one's own diligence. He thought of Gideon, of Clara, and of the family who had once defined his sense of worth through neglect and bias. They were no longer the arbiters of his value. By confronting the external pressures with evidence and restraint, Ezra had reinforced an internal truth. His worth was self-determined. The whispers, the doubts, the media scrutiny, they were mere echoes, irrelevant against a life built with patience, precision, and unyielding discipline. The world had tried to impose narrative upon him, but he reclaimed it quietly, methodically, and entirely on his own terms. As he returned home that evening, the city lights reflecting across the river, Ezra felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Not triumph in the face of family, but the serenity of independence. The struggle had been long, the challenge exhausting, but in the end, he had emerged intact, untarnished, and free. For the first time, he realized that true success was not only in financial stability, but in the sovereignty of oneself, untouched by expectation, undeterred by gossip, and unshakable in the face of deliberate exclusion. Ezra set down his coffee, the fading aroma of dark roast mingling with the crisp night air. He had endured the storm. He had weathered the scrutiny. And while the family's judgment would persist in various forms, he had secured a truth no rumor could touch. A life built from his own hands, guided by his own principles and validated by no one but himself. Thanksgiving night arrived like a quiet storm, the streets outside glowing with festive lights and laughter that never invited him in. Ezra had prepared nothing. No grand gestures, no desperate messages, no expectation of reconciliation. He had learned over the years that the heart of freedom lay not in appeasing others, but in claiming one's own space, one's own narrative. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and cedar, the remnants of a morning spent reviewing transactions and organizing paperwork. The quiet was thick, comforting, a reminder that this life, built meticulously, patiently, and silently, was his own. The knock on the door came unexpectedly, measured, deliberate, not frantic, not apologetic. This was a visit orchestrated with intent. Ezra opened the door to see the familiar faces he had avoided for months. Gideon's posture was polished, deliberate, and Clara's expression was unreadable, rehearsed. Their eyes swept over him, appraising, measuring, like one measures a rare collectible. Curious, calculating, but lacking true understanding. Ezra did not flinch. He held himself in the same quiet strength that had guided him through the years. They stepped forward, voices tentative at first, layered with performative warmth. Carefully curated concern. Ezra let them speak, not because he wanted to hear excuses, but to hear the measure of the world they still believed they controlled. Each phrase about collaboration, family, and opportunity was met with the same calm response in his mind. Verification first, emotion second, dignity always. He led them into the living room. The space modest yet precise, each piece of furniture, each object, a testament to his care and discipline. Gideon attempted small talk, leaning into the veneer of civility, but Ezra's mind remained focused on the underlying currents. This was a confrontation disguised as civility, an attempt to leverage familial authority into financial gain. Ezra observed quietly, allowing them to exhaust themselves in performative motions. When the conversation inevitably turned to numbers, opportunities, and investment proposals, Ezra leaned forward, his voice measured but sharp. "You want to talk about my portfolio, my investments, my achievements? Everything is documented, everything legal, everything legitimate. You may have assumed otherwise, but assumptions do not define reality." His eyes held steady on Gideon's, calm yet unyielding. There was a pause, the air thick with tension. Clara attempted to interject with familial appeals, a subtle attempt to shift the narrative from legality to morality, from facts to emotion. Ezra did not waver. "No one owns my life. No one dictates my worth. Years of diligence, patience, and quiet persistence cannot be erased by gossip, assumptions, or curated appearances." The words hung in the room like invisible barriers. Then came the revelation he had been waiting for, not from them, but from within. He realized that the family's approval had never been necessary for his validation. Their absence, their judgments, their orchestrated attempt to control had only clarified what he had already known. His value was self-determined. No applause, no acknowledgement, no recognition could add to what he had built silently, step by step, year by year. Ezra opened his folder, spreading notarized records, investment statements, and clear, undeniable proof across the table. Each document was a testament to years of patience, sacrifice, and intelligent decision-making. "Here," he said, voice calm but firm, "you can see for yourselves, everything transparent, everything accountable. My success is mine, earned in silence while assumptions filled the air." He watched as Gideon's practiced composure wavered, as Clara's forced smile faltered, and as the weight of undeniable truth pressed against the constructed illusions. The room fell silent, no words remaining to bridge the gap between perception and reality. Ezra took a breath, the kind that carries both relief and finality, and continued. "This ends here. You may try to reinterpret the past, manipulate perception, or claim moral authority, but I have lived my life honestly. I have built a life independent of your recognition, and I will continue to do so. You are welcome to observe, but you no longer dictate the terms of my existence." He watched as their expressions shifted, realization dawning that control had slipped from their grasp. The carefully rehearsed words, the subtle manipulations, the assumptions of superiority, all were meaningless against a foundation of patience, discipline, and integrity. Ezra felt an unfamiliar lightness, as if invisible chains had dissolved in the act of speaking truth aloud. Turning toward the door, he paused, the weight of years pressing briefly against his chest, not with regret, but with acknowledgement. This was a turning point, a pivot from a life shadowed by neglect and condescension to one fully illuminated by self-respect and autonomy. As he opened the door to leave the past behind, he felt the air differently, lighter, freer, and unmistakably his own. Outside, the streets were quiet, the neighborhood carrying on with its ordinary life. Ezra stepped into the night, each footfall deliberate, each breath measured, and each heartbeat a reminder of hard-won freedom. The stars above, indifferent and infinite, mirrored the expanse of opportunity now stretching before him. He realized that success was never about recognition or approval, but about the sovereignty to define one's own life, unbound by expectation, unshaken by scrutiny, and unassailable in truth. As the night deepened, Ezra felt the cumulative weight of years, the struggles, the quiet victories, and a moment of unseen diligence coalesce into a singular, enduring truth. He was no longer defined by absence or neglect. He was defined by his choices, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to the life he had quietly, meticulously, and triumphantly built. In that moment, Ezra Kane was free, not because the world had acknowledged him, but because he had acknowledged himself. The family, the whispers, the assumptions, they all remained behind, locked in rooms that no longer held power over his future. And for the first time, the world felt wide open, inviting and entirely his to navigate on his own terms. Morning came quiet and cold, the kind of early light that seeps slowly through blinds and paints the room in muted gold. Ezra stood at the edge of his balcony, staring at the city stretching before him. The hum of life carried on below, cars, distant conversations, a dog barking, but none of it demanded anything from him. For the first time in decades, he felt the clarity of solitude as something sacred, not lonely. He thought about the Thanksgiving night confrontation, the words exchanged, the folder of evidence laid bare on the table. The weight of years spent unnoticed, underestimated, and dismissed had finally lifted. It wasn't anger that remained. It was calm, an unshakable understanding of his own worth. Ezra smiled faintly, the kind of smile that doesn't seek approval or recognition. It existed only for him. The days that followed were simple, deliberate, and unhurried. Ezra focused on his work, on projects he put aside while navigating the complexities of family expectations. Each investment, each plan, each decision felt lighter now, no longer tainted by the fear of judgment or the need for validation. He realized that success wasn't just numbers on paper or wealth accumulated in secret. It was peace, self-respect, and the ability to live on his own terms. He heard nothing from his family after that night. No calls, no messages, no inquiries about his well-being. And yet, he didn't miss them, not in the way he once would have. The absence that had haunted him for years became a kind of freedom, a quiet space to grow, explore, and exist fully without interference. He planted small seeds in his life, investments, hobbies, relationships that were no longer rushed or hidden. Each one grew naturally, reflecting the patience he had cultivated for years. One evening, as the city lights blinked on and reflected off the windows, Ezra poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching life move around him. He realized that the value of his labor, the resilience in the quiet years, and the silent victories no one witnessed had built something stronger than family approval ever could. He had become his own anchor, his own witness, his own home. For the first time, he allowed himself to think of the future without the weight of old grudges, without the shadow of dismissal. He was free to make choices unbound by expectation, free to define success not by comparison, but by fulfillment, free to measure his worth only by the life he wanted to lead. Ezra leaned back, the hum of the city below blending with the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The past was a story he could now tell without pain, a chapter that had shaped him but no longer controlled him. And in that understanding, he found serenity that no wealth, recognition, or family approval had ever granted. He had arrived at the one place that mattered, fully himself. He whispered to the quiet room, almost to no one, "I am enough. I have always been enough." And for the first time, he truly believed it. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows that mirrored the long years of struggle, and Ezra Kane smiled, finally free, untethered, unjudged, and entirely his own. The life he had built in silence was now a life lived openly, honestly, and completely. And that, he realized, was more than any approval or invitation could ever offer. The story ended not with conflict or vindication, but with freedom, a quiet triumph earned by patience, perseverance, and unwavering belief in oneself. Ezra stepped away from the window, ready to face tomorrow not as a man waiting for recognition, but as a man who had finally claimed his own life.